Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Oh, is there an audience? Good morning. All right. My name is Neil Roberts. I teach Africana Studies, Political Theory, and the Philosophy of Religion here at Williams College. And I also have the pleasure of being the W. Ford 50 Schumann Faculty Fellow in Democratic Studies, who directs the Schumann program. And it is a real delight. I know many of you even early on a Saturday morning when the weather relatively in this region is about 40 degrees higher than it's been. So hopefully that's good omens for the rest of the day. Before briefly talking about why this conference and transitioning to our first panel, I just wanted to offer several thank yous. First and foremost to two colleagues of mine in the Schumann program, Veronica Bosley and Carrie Green, who I think our speakers can agree went above and beyond the call of duty in terms of making sure travel details, sending draft program, editing, keeping me on track, and just making sure everything has run smoothly, including today. So if we can please just a round of applause for Veronica and Carrie. I'd like to thank other bodies on campus that have supported the Schumann program, particularly the Dean of the Faculty's Office, and various faculty associated with the program in different units. I'd like to thank our 12 speakers who we'll hear from today through the panels and also the keynote presentation. I would like to thank my colleagues Gretchen Long, Laura Ephraim, and Mark Reinhardt for agreeing on a Saturday to be able to moderate our panels, and so I'm definitely looking forward to these panels momentarily. And thanks for all of you who have come both from on and off campus. And so why this particular conference? I've spent, or I've at least tried to spend a large part of my own academic career trying to think about what we mean by the idea of freedom, but admitting my own lacks, one of the things that I and even some others have not done done well as much is really thinking about not only what we mean by freedom, but also what we mean by democracy and what, if any, are the relationship between the two. And so and some of this is mentioned in the conference program, but I would just like to kind of read it, is that really today we're trying to explore not only the different terms, these terms democracy and freedom, but also trying to think through what is a democracy? What does it mean to refer to a democracy dying or being forged? Right? A lot of literature and a lot of discussion, even in this last year, individuals talking about democracies dying, assuming that they were already living in a democracy, whatever that is, may mean. Should we link or decouple freedom and slavery, let alone what does the idea of freedom mean? What is the relationship between democracy and freedom? Are democracy and freedom mutually reinforcing or incompatible ideals? To what extent do our interpretations of democracy and freedom impact notions such as statecraft, civil society, family, the individual, groups, and governance? And do conceptions of race, gender, sex, sexuality, class, ability, and nation transform the theoretical frameworks and real-world articulations of the free life and the democratic life? And I believe also in the keynote there's going to be a question too about how do we understand kind of equality and inequality with regards to these ideas as well. And so what I was hoping, and hopefully this is the case for everyone, is really to ask people whose work I think extremely highly of to try and shed light on these and other questions, but also, and if you take a look at your program, it was very intentional to, in many regards, be able to invite, if they were to say yes, some people who might know one another, right, whether in person or their work, but also in fields that she or he might not necessarily be as familiar with their respective works. So to really have a dialogue across not only the humanities and social sciences, but also the physical and the natural about the conference theme. And so the panels were have been broken up into 4 segments to try and have as close as possible different papers that speak to one another, but also have their own distinctions. The last remark I'd like to say before turning it over to Professor Long to introduce our first panel is I am somewhat of a social media geek. I had Facebook, so I have an almost 11-year-old and a 3-year-old, so I felt like when I was on Facebook at one point, I was really high in technology, and then I heard this thing called Twitter, or like, what does it mean to tweet? I didn't know what that was, so now I think I know that better. I have an Instagram account, but I still don't totally know that. Snapchat, I don't even deal with much. But in any form of social media that you are at and use now, what I am asking gently is throughout the day, if you either live tweet or if you take, particularly in terms of the question of the archive, if there are pictures or anything related to the conference, if you use the hashtag, and I'll just say it 3 times, just the hashtag, all connected, democracy, freedom, Williams. So it's just hashtag democracy, freedom, Williams. Democracy, Freedom, Williams, then that way we can literally create an archive of much of what is going on today, especially for those who weren't able to join us. So again, thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it over to Gretchen to get us started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Williams. It's going to be a beautiful, beautiful day. I get the treat of sort of hosting and organizing the first panel, but I will just say on a personal/professional note, my office is on the 2nd floor of Hollander, and it's right across the hall from Neil's office. And so I have seen this conference sort of spewing out in drafts on the printer and hearing him across the hall on the phone and hearing enslavement and language, no, genres of struggle, no, and fugitivity and freedom. So I really just want to honor Neil, who's put all those words together into this program for what looks like a really exciting and interesting day. And I was really pleased when he asked me to moderate this first panel. So today we have, the name of the panel is, I'm going through this program I've seen on the printer a million times. Our first panel is called Enslavement, Dignity, and Genres of Freedom. And our presenters are Professor Nick Brammell from down the road at UMass Amherst, who'll be presenting a paper on power, dignity, rights, the political philosophy of Frederick Douglass, and Yasmin Saidullah from Vassar College. Her paper's entitled The Hearts We Beat, Reflections on the Kinds of Freedom She Wanted While Still Within the Hold of Slavery. Great title. I want to tell you a tiny bit about our 2 panelists. This is drawn from the program. Nick Brammell is professor of English at UMass Amherst, and his primary research seeks to reconfigure conventional understanding of U.S. intellectual history by demonstrating that works of literature and popular culture can be expressions of philosophy and political theory. His publications reflect his particular interest in bridging the gap between academic discourse and public debate. He's the founding editor of Boston Review. Yeah, I'm a fan, so thank you, thank you for that, and welcome. Yasmin Saidullah, as I mentioned, is at Vassar. She's a black feminist political theorist of abolition, as well as co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race to Love and Liberation, that came out just in 2016. Her research brings a black feminist approach to questions of political theory to ask how the carceral logics of modern freedom are challenged by captive black women's demands for abolition. And sadly, I imagine you have a lot of material to work with as a historian of the US and a thinking citizen today. So welcome. If we'll come up to the top, we'll hear both their papers.
Thank you, Neil, for bringing us all together. And I saw Karen when I came in. I don't think I've seen Veronica, and maybe they've left, but thanks to them also so much. I've carved a little bit of a book I'm working on now about the political philosophy of Frederick Douglass, to I hope that I can get these parts to address the conference theme. I want to begin by just giving a little bit of an overview of what's been written about the political philosophy of Frederick Douglass. So, two monographs have been written, both of them excellent, one by Peter Myers and another by Nick Buchala, and they both argue, assembling a great deal of data in support of their arguments, that Frederick Douglass is best understood as a natural rights liberal. Okay? And then Robert Gooding Williams, in his book about Du Bois, has that very interesting chapter on Douglass, in which he suggests that Douglass might be better understood as someone kind of in the Philip Pettit freedom as non-domination camp, so to speak. Then you also have Angela Davis actually saying, well, or suggesting anyway, she said, like, Douglass sheds more light on freedom than the entire canon of Western philosophy does. And in particular, what he reveals is that freedom is not a given. You know, freedom cannot be, is not a given. And then our own, very own Neil Roberts, really following along the same path, carving out this notion of comparative freedom, a freedom that is neither given nor absolute, but is always in relation, you might say, to its conditions of possibility. And I kind of situate my work coming more out of the Angela Davis and Neil path. That is, they're both less concerned with finding the label that we already have, like republicanism or natural rights, saying, well, Douglass was that. And they're more interested in actually just listening to what Douglass wrote and then trying to name what that is. And sometimes those labels come in handy, but the kind of the purpose is not to put him in one of those categories. So, but where I kind of, either you could say, do something a little bit different from Neil and Angela Davis, or maybe just following through further, is the more I read Douglass and read him, the more I began to see this word power everywhere in his work. And I've got a feeling if you did like a digital word search of Douglass, you would indeed find that the word power comes up many, many more times in his work than freedom and liberty combined. Okay, so power, and then another word that comes in a lot in his work is duty. A tremendous amount of duty, and he often plays on this word bound. I am bound to do something, I'm bound to do that. This again, he's expressing something about the way he views citizenship and freedom as being conditioned also by our duties, the duties of citizenship, the duties that are actually built into freedom. So, we're all familiar. Let me begin by sharing this quotation from an 1867 speech of Douglass's. From this little bit of experience, slave experience, I have elaborated quite a lengthy chapter of political philosophy applicable to the American people. So we're all familiar with the Declaration of Independence, and it's a declaration that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with particular rights, and that freedom, liberty is one of those rights, life, pursuit of happiness, and so on. And this is the radical message of the Declaration that Frederick Douglass himself strongly and repeatedly affirmed, maybe most famously in his July 4th address, when he called it the ring bolt of the nation's destiny. But, in my view, Douglass also believed that this theory that we are endowed with rights and that democracy and civil government comes out of that endowment needed to be supplemented or modified because it has three inherent weaknesses. One of these is conceptual. What makes us worthy of the rights with which the Creator has endowed us? And when we no longer believe that a Creator has endowed us with these rights, Douglass certainly moved to this position, we have to ask, what makes it reasonable for us to bestow rights upon ourselves? What is it about human beings that seems to us to make them, us, worthy of certain rights. And the idea that we have a right to have rights, by the way, that Randy and I did, is ridiculous because it just pushes the question one step further down the road. What gives us the right to confer upon ourselves the right to have rights? A second weakness Douglas perceived in the theory that we are endowed with rights is that, as a theory, it implies nothing at all about exercising or demanding those rights. The passive possession of them seems sufficient. And the third deficiency that Douglas noted and tried to address is that it sheds no light on, indeed does not mention, the creation and recognition of human solidarities that democratic polities require. So toward the end of My Bondage and My Freedom, when he describes how he felt upon arriving in New York after his escape from Baltimore, Douglas remarks, "The slave has all his life been learning the power of his master, being trained to dread his approach, and only a few hours learning the power of the free state." This keen attunement to power was the major contribution his slave experience made to his political philosophy. Douglas began to philosophize in earnest, I believe, when he became an independent black intellectual and editor of the North Star in 1847. But he did not articulate his attunement to power in theoretical language until an 1851 speech. There he began, as he often did, with a conventional invocation of the right to freedom. Quote, "The great truth to man's right to liberty entered into the very idea of man's creation. It was born with us, and no laws, constitutions, compacts, agreements, or combinations can ever abrogate or destroy it." And it's on the basis of remarks like that and many other similar remarks that Buchla and Myers argue, plausibly, that Douglas was a natural rights liberal. But a moment later in the same speech, Douglas goes on to say that this is quotation, that man's right to liberty is written upon all the powers and faculties of man. 3 years later, in his January 1854, in another speech, he goes on to say, more or less word for word the same, "The great truth of man's right to liberty is written on all the powers and faculties of the human soul." And 6 months after that, in his important lecture, "The Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered," Douglas broadened the claim he made about the importance of our powers, asserting now that they constitute our humanness per se. Quote, "To know whether a man is a Negro, it must first be known what constitutes a man. Man is distinguished from all other animals by the possession of certain definite faculties and powers, as well as by physical organization and properties. These sentences suggest that humans are endowed with certain distinctive powers and faculties first, and that their rights are written upon them afterward. Indeed, the metaphor implies that we can read our rights only out of those powers as an inference from them." In an 1866 editorial, now we're flashing forward, on woman suffrage, Douglas made this implicit theory explicit, and he also specified what two of these distinctive human powers are. Quote, "If woman is admitted to be a moral and intellectual being," there are the two powers, "possessing a sense of good and evil and a power of choice between them," there's that word power again, "her case is already half gained. Our natural powers are the foundation of our natural rights. And it is a consciousness of powers which suggests the exercise of rights. Man can only exercise the powers he possesses, and he can only conceive of rights in the presence of powers." This incredibly rich theoretical passage has to be unpacked. Douglas makes clear that the natural powers he has in mind include specifically moral and intellectual powers. He now explicitly states that our natural powers are the foundation of our natural rights. We are born with certain rights only because we are born with certain powers. He also warns that although our powers are embedded in our nature so that we naturally exercise them, we are not as readily aware that they are the foundation of our rights. More precisely, and I think Douglas is much more careful with his words than we tend to think he was, more precisely, quote, "It is consciousness of powers that suggests the exercise of rights." In other words, we may possess powers without knowing that we do, and consciousness of our powers is crucial because that is what suggests the exercise and not just the passive possession of our rights. and the exercise would include demanding those rights. As we've seen as early as 1854, Douglas stated that these powers constitute our humanness, what it makes human, and implying that that's what also constitutes our human dignity or our human worth. And in another editorial on women's suffrage in the 1860s, he made this point explicit also. But whatever may be thought as to the consequences of allowing women to vote, it is plain that women themselves are divested of a large measure of their natural dignity by their exclusion from such participation in government. To deny a woman her right to vote is to abridge her natural and social power, and to deprive her of a certain measure of respect. Woman herself loses in her own estimation of herself by her enforced exclusion from the elective franchise, just as slaves doubted their own fitness for freedom from the fact of being looked down upon as fit only for slaves. What we see here is that Douglas's theory of our rights deriving from our powers is also a theory of dignity as needing recognition and affirmation. This too derived from his slave experience, as the last phrase suggests. Douglas's theory of power probably originated in his first-hand experience of the ways the slavery system strove to make the slave doubt his own fitness for freedom. And it did so primarily, he believed, by denying that they possessed the powers that constitute human dignity, which in turn allowed them to expropriate without guilt or without admitted guilt the physical powers of the enslaved. The aim of slavery, he argued, was to, quote, buy and sell, to brand and scourge human beings with a heavy lash, to destroy their dignity as human beings. And when Douglas escaped to the North in 1837, he discovered that whites' denial of blacks' human powers and dignity was as active there as in the South. In a May 1858 speech protesting segregation on New York City's 6th Avenue train line, he said, "I see in the exclusion of the colored man from the 6th Avenue rail cars the cruel and malignant spirit of caste, which is the foundation and is the cause, as well as the effect, of our American slave system." He argued further that the purpose of this malignant spirit was to crush blacks' self-respect and make them doubt their own fitness for freedom. Quote, "One of the most saddening results of the circumstances of our people is that those circumstances tend to destroy our own faith in ourselves. Having seen ourselves oppressed, despised, and hated for so many long and bitter years, we come to think at last that degradation is our doom. Instead of attributing our condition to the injustice and oppression which have been heaped upon us, we sink down into the belief that we are the victims of a natural inferiority. Thus, as Douglas saw it, the root purpose of white prejudice was to persuade blacks of their own natural inferiority and unfitness for freedom, thereby ensuring that, lacking dignity in their own eyes, they would not respond to racism with indignant demands for their civic and political rights. This is why Douglas believed that black resistance to the slavery system and to anti-black racism required free blacks to meet white racism at its point of attack, their dignity. Douglas's powers-based theory of human and democratic rights offers a concrete answer to the question, what makes it reasonable for us to bestow our rights upon ourselves? What is it about human beings that makes us worthy of rights? Douglas replies, in answer to those questions, it is our human powers that make it reasonable for us to do so. It is those human powers that give us our natural dignity, that make us respect-worthy, and that thereby form the foundation of our natural rights. The second weakness Douglas perceived in the idea of citizens being endowed with rights is that it implies nothing at all about citizens exercising or demanding those rights. Clearly, this is why he derived his power-based theory of rights to meet this problem. Of course, no theory alone can move people to political subjectification in Rancière's term, or political awakening or political action. Theory cannot do that. But a theory may be couched in language that is less or more conducive to that transformation. A rights-based theory implies that we always already have our rights, that freedom is natural, and thus disposes many to political quiescence. A powers-based theory tells us that we must be conscious of and exercise our powers in order to assert and protect our rights. I now turn to the third weakness of the rights-based theory, that it sheds no light or makes no mention on the creation and recognition of human solidarities that democratic polities require. This was crucial for Douglas because he saw the need for solidarity based not on race, kinship, ethnicity, and the like. In an 1883 lecture called It Moves, or the Philosophy of Reform, by the way, right up there with the most important speeches Douglas ever gave. I strongly recommend that you all read it. Douglas gave his fullest and most philosophical account of how a powers-based theory remedies this weakness, and not coincidentally, it also articulates the linkage between a power-centered conception of rights and citizens' political subjectification and mobilization. In this lecture, Douglas asks, whence comes that irresistible power that impels men to brave all the hardships and dangers involved in pioneering an unpopular cause? Has it a celestial or a natural origin? Is it human, or is it divine, or is it both? I have no hesitation, this is the late Douglas, I have no hesitation stating where I stand in respect to these questions. It seems to me that the true philosophy of reform, and he would say also of democracy, is not found in the clouds or in the stars or anywhere outside of humanity itself. Douglas continues by arguing that this power lies within humanity itself. He, man, is an object not only to himself but to his species, and his species an object to him. Every well-formed man finds no rest to his soul, while any portion of his species suffers from a recognized evil. The deepest wish of a true man's heart is that the good may be augmented and evil, moral and physical, be diminished, and that each generation shall be improvement on its predecessor. Now, Douglas asserts here that an irresistible power within humanity itself is the source of all reform. This power gives human beings a particular dignity, but something else contributes to our dignity as well. Our ability to be conscious of having those powers, and our ability to be conscious depends to some degree on others recognizing our powers and their being conscious of our powers, okay? So the very notion for Douglas of being a self means to be a human self, and the very notion of a human self means belonging to a human species. Self-consciousness is always species consciousness. This is the basis of human solidarity. And this is why Douglas asserted we are instinctively agitated when we see another human being suffering. It is also why we feel an intuitive wish for the welfare of others. And it is also why no person, not even a hardened slave driver, in his opinion, can be utterly deaf to an oppressed person's cries for succor or mercy. As he writes in My Bondage, it is beyond the power of slavery to annihilate affinities recognized and established by the Almighty. The slave is bound, there's that word again, to mankind by the powerful and inextricable network of human brotherhood. His voice is the voice of a man, human. His cry is the cry of a man, human in distress. And man, human, must cease to be man, human, before he can become insensible to that cry. Only self-consciousness, species consciousness, and species, all these come together to make us desire the good for others. In fact, this wish, Douglas says, becomes a duty. It becomes what becomes one of the laws of our own being. All reform is an effort to bring man more and more into harmony with the laws of his own being and with those of the universe. If the smallest particle of matter in any part of the universe is subject to the law, it seems to me that a thing so important as the moral nature of man cannot be less so. I think it will be found that all genuine reform rests on the assumption that man is a creature of absolute, inflexible law, moral and spiritual, and that his happiness and well-being can only be secured by perfect obedience to such law. Okay? This is a very severe philosophy, one that goes considerably beyond Kant's conception of moral autonomy and figures moral law as intrinsic to our species nature rather than as a matter of individual choice. It is also one that we might look upon with considerable suspicion today, having absorbed Foucault's argument that self-enforcing of the law is at bottom an introjection into ourselves of social power. My purpose here is not to defend Douglas's political thought. just to describe it. Not every part of it's going to resonate with us. It came, after all, out of his experience of enslavement. But I will point out that it does address the third weakness that he perceived in rights-based theory and offers a coherent explanation of how political communities should express and nurture human solidarity or brotherhood. Thank you very much.
That was such a wonderful meditation to begin this conversation. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. And thank you, everyone, for making this convening and conversation possible. I know there's a lot of hard work that goes into just showing up. So I'll just say that the work that I'm doing on Jacobs picks up very nicely from this conversation that Nick started us off with in terms of thinking through the limits of rights discourse as a viable and sufficient refuge for those dispossessed from the protections of the law. And really thinking about what the implications of this movement of species consciousness is, from human cry to wish to duty to solidarity. So reading Harriet Jacobs' 1861 Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl has become a practice of returning to what really matters about freedom for me. It's a practice in learning to return to the landscapes of slavery and read them for their loopholes, for their hiding places. There's always something you missed, as Nick and I were talking about over dinner last night, because the protocol of survival detailed in its pages is also a method of narration designed to protect as it professes. Its narrative account of resistance lays out what Stephanie Camp would call geographies of containment, and within its bounds there are multiple concentric geographies of containment to account for. An economy of scale ranging from the tiny garret space where its protagonist and author hid from the hunt of her owners, out of their reach but well within sight of her children, whom she'd watched grow up for 7 years through the tiny holes she drilled into the wall of her hiding place. Incidents charts its geographies of containment from the garret space to the plantation itself, and from the plantation south to the landscape of a nation on the eve of civil war. We today return to Jacobs to read the landscapes of freedom and captivity from the point of view of the fugitive, of the truant, from an anamorphic vantage point that casts the familiar backdrops and horizons of our own political moment into strained perspective. Incidents insists I interrogate my own sense of time and how its passage through the testimony of lived experience of the past can transform my own orientation to race, place, gender, and belonging along abolitionist routes all too precarious and provisional to be deemed escape. And in this way, it echoes a lot of the notion of boundedness to community. All of us are none. That's in the Douglas as well. So thinking with Stephanie Camp, we might consider Jacobs' practice of withdrawal into the hidden spaces of slavery's domestication of law and order, not only as an extension of her ideological investment in the project of abolition, but as a practice of resistance to slavery's hold on the meaning of both freedom and captivity. Life in the loophole was neither promising nor predictable. The garret's cover offered little opportunity for her to move or stand. It provided limited protection from the elements and vermin. Nevertheless, in her slave narrative, Jacob states, "There is no place where slavery existed that could have afforded me so good a place of concealment." No place, rather than a better place, becomes the condition of possibility for a call for abolition that demanded more than a vertical call for rights and recognition. An abolitionist demand from no place required more than self-possession. It would be a congregational practice of care in its mobilization of collective survival. The moral ambiguity of Jacob's demand from no place animates then a congregational politics of retreat from consent to politics as usual. Jacobs rooted her abolitionist demand in the realizing sense, as she calls it in her narrative's preface, of what freedom meant, not in the abstract, not as an ideal, but in the material desire of those still in bondage. Retreat, refusal, and truancy displaced then direct confrontations or escape north as indicators of resistance to slavery. As her brother John S. Jacobs implies in his own slave narrative account of his sister's time in hiding, the purchase of the loophole is in its ability to serve the cause of abolition without making a spectacle of itself in the process, in clandestine, surreptitious ways. In his True Tale of Slavery, John Jacobs describes the loophole as, quote, the space between the roof and ceiling, which was from 3.5 to 4 feet in height, running off to a point. My uncle made a cupboard in one corner of this room with the top attached to the ceiling. The part of the board that covered the top of the cupboard was cut and made into a trap door. The whole of it was so small and neatly done that no one could have believed it to be what it was, the entrance to her hiding place. Over the course of her life, Jacob's no place becomes a moving metaphor for the roots of her abolitionist activism. The enduring value of the abolitionist struggle for freedom from no place is as analytically rich as it is historically descriptive. Without personhood, without a self to defend, enslaved communities knew the protocols of the patriarchal institution obtained as much in the South as they did in the North and required coming together rather than standing one's ground on one's own. There was, in fact, no place, so long as slavery lived, for fugitives to feel at home within the nation's embrace. Fugitive familiars were therefore found in clandestine and encrypted encounters and hiding in makeshift shelters, swampy in-between spaces, stolen moments. For the enslaved, truants, and fugitives, then, there was no place like home, precisely because home was not a place, but an embodied improvisational fugitive practice of escape, of retreat from a place where the idea that people can be property could be rational, justified, and defended. Imagined futures, as Angela Davis reminded her audience in 2018, in a 2018 lecture in Berlin, thinking about the relationship between art and activism. She says, imagined futures are necessary ways of navigating the structural cruelties of the present, the post-colonial and post-slavery present. I join Maria Domar Castro in thinking about the meaning of utopia. I like the idea of thinking of utopia as a no place, rather than a better place, because it does not allow us to forget that we produce the present as an intersection between the past and the future, not as some kind of disembodied place outside of history. It retains a space of negativity, a vantage point that allows us to critically question the present. As Davis writes in her reflections of the Black woman's role in the community of slaves, written from a jail cell in 1971 where she was confined while awaiting trial, she argues that not all enslaved women's labor was subject to the use of those who owned them. There were futures, though perhaps merely imagined, that Black women worked for that lived in excess of the reproduction of one another's lives as profit for the owners of their exploitation. It worked in service to their mutual survival with and through one another's care. As gender studies scholar Catherine McKittrick writes, there is a lack of authority given Black women's geographic knowledge and experiences of their containment. The space Harriet Jacobs discloses, McKittrick writes, both in the landscape of slavery and through her sense of place, demonstrates an unresolved but workable opposition to geographic domination that remains largely undetectable. Be they fact or speculative fiction, these intimate practices of truancy, garroting, and Black domestic homemaking complicate contemporary imaginations of freedom as they center neither safety nor security, neither freedom nor fugitivity, but alternative routes of being, feeling, and embodying both enslavement and freedom to live beyond the reach of respectability and far from the protections of citizenship. The abolitionist feminism that Davis authors into the abolitionist tradition in the 1970s in the wake of George Jackson's assassination and the Attica Uprising draws its ethics of accountability from the congregational cultures of care born of Black feminist activism in the late 60s and 70s. In her introduction to Sister Love, the letters of Audre Lorde and Pat Parker, 1974 to 1989, gender studies scholar Mecca Sullivan describes this work as, quote, the Black feminist literary practice and politics that for many of us shapes the work we do today. It's a politics of collaborative self-authorship and self-authorization. Sullivan calls it a process of survival that, she writes, quote, comprises humor, anger, tension, and tenderness as these women write themselves and us into a Black feminist future. It is a future of a dream that remained as yet unrealized in the final pages of Jacob's Incidents, but which she had seeded with her words into the cracked earth and uneven ground of her own geography of containment. As Stephen Dillon writes, reflecting on the conditions of possibility that led to the rise of the George Jackson Brigade's revolutionary marauding, he writes, quote, the forces that create difference do not determine its future. Something takes flight and escapes even as capture is always imminent. Norms never act once. And since they must be endlessly repeated to have no single origin, their operation is not deterministic. Their future is unknown. Returning to Jacobs, whom I've learned to read by way of reading practices honed from her 20th and 21st century Black feminist grandchildren, Davis, Camp, and McKittrick among them, is to ask what challenge, if any, do these non-binary acts of abolition, acts that suggest flight north under cover of night, was not the only route enslaved people found to move closer to freedom. It poses what question do these pose to political projects of Black liberation today? What political imagination of liberation have truancy, absenteeism, and garroting passed down to present-day landscapes of rights-based desires, especially for those brave enough to continue advancing the movement for Black life today? What we encounter in our returns to Davis, who returns us to Jacobs, is what I want to call a congregational orientation to survival, one in which the triumph over domination is found within its hold, rather than imagine abolition as a top-down breakdown of intersecting structures of racial capitalism from above or the overthrow of an insurgent takedown from below. Returning to the role of Black women's work and roles within the abolitionist tradition return us to the ways we might read the movement of abolition as an inside job, as an embodied practice of breaking open the inherent contradictions of violence and safety, embedded within the carceral imaginations of freedom born of chattel slavery. Their legacies of survival, to live in the loopholes of the peculiar institution under the surveillance of its gaze, was the condition of possibility for Black women's contributions to the abolitionist tradition, and really embolden a protocol of resistance passed on by a kind of practice of care that retreats from what Angela Davis described as the unmitigated totalitarianism of their containment. As Camp writes, we must proceed from the conviction that dichotomies such as personal, political, materialistic, symbolic, organized rebellion, everyday resistance, accommodation, resistance, obscure at least as much as they reveal, overlooking the links between the public and the private, between material or political issues on the one hand and cultural or intimate issues on the other, limits our understanding of human lives in the past, especially women's lives. Despite the ways the state, as ethnic studies scholar Lisa Lowe reminds us, subsumes colonial violence within narratives of modern reason and progress, the circulation of Jacob's Testament against slavery and others like it continued to work on understandings of the human, personhood, and rights long beyond the advent of emancipation, throughout the era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and well into the 20th century struggles for civil rights and the vote. Though she herself laments that there is no home for her and her children at the end of her narrative, inscriptions of their dreams of freedom are nailed onto the trapdoors of the peculiar institution. The residue of its as yet unrealized abolitionist dreams, imaginations, and realizing sense of freedom remain emergent some 100 years later in the kitchen tables of Black feminist collectives, in the displacing of Henry James with Jacobs in American literature syllabi, and in contemporary commemorations of Black liberation through the chanting of Assata Shakur's call for breaking our chains. Though still submerged within patrilineal histories of abolitionist progress, I'm interested in the ways these narratives and theories of abolition hold us to account for each other, even as they hold us to account for our dreams, freedom dreams. I'm interested in how accounts of congregating alone begin to resist the unmitigated totalitarianism of capitalist care economies and their effects, the effects of their technological stress on our desire to imagine freedom, our consciousness of what it is we say we want, our ability to move towards a kind of freedom that she wanted while still within the hold of slavery. In this way, Jacobs represents so much of what so many of us are still struggling to know how to say. As historian and critical theorist Cedric Robinson reminds us, creative reconfigurations of Western concepts live other lives within artistic renderings of the Black experience, of Black suffering, and though they have a tendency to be conscripted, commodified, and consumed, they often resurface in ways that prove credible to projects of liberation their creators could not have imagined. We are only just beginning to understand the degree to which liberation is a collective process, as disability justice scholar Mia Mingus writes. Congregational movement against the momentum of collective alienation, criminalization, and disposability, in order to fight the habituations of this tradition that indoctrinate even as they emancipate and have a tendency to cause us to forget to remember how we got free, have a tendency to teach us to forget to remember how we know what we know about domination, leaving little space within that mental slavery to practice anything else. To feel somehow otherwise, we have to practice the kinds of relationships of accountability we want to have with ourselves, with each other, the land, this planet, to the future, and our understanding of the past. Mingus writes, quote, "This is not about perfection, but practice, falling down and about getting up, spectacular failures, and learning how we can be and do better, resilience in the face of fear, humility in the face of ego, faith in the face of hopelessness. This is about understanding organizing as a spiritual practice that is just as much about our souls as it is about our goals. How do we cultivate the kind of commitment to each other that can withstand failures, heartbreak, disappointment, gossip, mistakes, and conflict?" Too often, the ways we work for social justice, for social change, are not working for us. Jacobs knew this reality of resistance all too well. For Jacobs, being Black, female, and responsible for children was a knowledge of self that required she depend on her community to get her free. She drew on a praxis of congregational defense against the living death of slavery. The loophole of retreat, with its own politics of containment, is a space, as Valerie Smith writes, that, quote, possesses an ambiguity of meaning, an avenue of escape. It is a aporatic space wherein the conventions of modern narratives of liberation fail to foment the gendered kinds of feeling free such stories were meant to invoke. Instead of mastery and overcoming, Jacobs emphasizes how her triumphs increase the degrees of her danger to herself and those who opt to love her. The slave community's protocols of, resistance fashioned means of escape from slavery that strangely retreated then from conventional regimes of exchange, waste, and representation, creating geographic and analytic loopholes from the discarded materiality of the domestic order and the dispossessions of plantation life. Communities of enslaved people, but especially women, as Stephanie Camp points out in Closer to Freedom, utilize strategies of retreat as alternatives to the prevalent violence recapture imposed upon many of their attempts to escape north, to make a place out of no place. As Camp writes, quote, "Places, boundaries, and movement were central to how slavery was organized and how it was resisted. The temporary escapes from the oppressive regimes between their own and others' quarters, swamps, woods, outbuilding, and farms plated these diverse spaces into shared rival geography that provided space and time not only for relief from exploitation, control, and surveillance, but also for independent activity. These retreats were not without consequences. Camp tells the story of Sally Smith, who would run away and stay away as long as she could sustain herself, foraging for food and water. When she returned out of necessity, her owner had her tortured inside a big barrel he kept to roll us in, with nails drove all through it. "Madam," she told the black woman interviewing her in the late 19th century, "I thought he was going to kill me." But she could barely walk, but another bondswoman greased her injuries, and she quickly went to work. "I suppose that was the end of your stay in the woods?" she asked her informer. "No, madam," Smith said. "I did not stay there more than a month before I ran away again. I tell you, I could not stay there." Camp uses Smith's words as the title for her chapter, "I Could Not Stay There," as a kind of dedication to the history of truancy, short escapes that disrupted the de jure and de facto practices of labor discipline of the South. Their strategic value as political and physical retreat from places of domination, from what Frantz Fanon might call slavery's zone of non-being, seems, upon first impression, to be the opposite of something modern liberal subjects would recognize as desirable spaces of resistance, wheresoever personal sovereignty becomes possible within slavery's dialectics of belonging. The threat of recapture always persists. Indeed, in counter-distinction to the geographic order of plantation life, no place is more than a site of slavery's domestic order. It always serves rather as a speculative place of possible reformation of slavery's dialectics of belonging and dispossession. Retreat is practical, but it also works on the level of phenomenological reordering of things to redress the domestic violence of slavery that slavery renders irredeemable. Retreat is not reclamation, but grants its actors powers of mobility, surveillance, and obscuration as yet unavailable. By inhabiting internal spaces of contradiction as their point of departure from slavery, the truant casts slavery's dialectic of mastery and captivity into a state of crisis, a place of contradiction, becoming conscious of itself. Following Camp's account of slavery and its geographies of containment on one hand, what Jacob's loophole of retreat affords is space and time for the creative destruction of her reliance upon slavery's domesticating protocols of subjection, for her congregationally derived realizing sense of self-protection, and the opportunity to participate in the reproduction of her day-to-day life in community with those who dare to stand in solidarity with her. On the other, it fractures the moral ground of both pro-slavery discourse and its antithesis, calling out the inconsistencies of those for whom abolition was about the redemption of innocence rather than repair of traumatic and dysfunctional social orders. Reading Jacobs, then, is a practice of learning how to read everything from slave narrative to black girl magic through the lexicon and liturgy of incidents. This present-day hashtag then becomes something more than a memorialization that commemorates the assimilation from the margins to the center. Its magic is a practical alchemy of souls whose stories breach the thresholds of their containment to survive slaughter, slavery, and subjection. Not as the walking dead, but as messengers who bore holes in the walls that border whiteness as property. There is in their echo a trace of the mandate of the movement for Black lives to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and to be transformed in the service of the work. An invitation for us to run with them from the geographies of our own containment through the swamps and seas of mass memory that hold all that we have yet to imagine about freedom, its domesticated captive. Thanks.
Thank you. I wonder if we could start off by hearing from our panelists and see, because I see so many synergies between your papers. If you have questions or comments for the other, or otherwise I can talk or we can open it up. Do you have anything?
I had a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
The desire to put Douglass in a camp of political ideology, natural law, liberalism, seems really generative in some ways, but it seems like what you were saying is that its description kind of makes us blind to the relational ethics of his boundedness to kinship and solidarity. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how that expression surfaces, because in Jacobs, I feel like she occupies these very familiar narrative constructs and frameworks, and she inserts her own kind of interventions into them constantly. And would you say something similar is happening with Douglas's inhabitation of natural law ideology?
For sure. I mean, in writing this book, there's part of my mind that was thinking all the time, what you really should be doing is writing a book that is just constantly putting Jacobs and Douglas into a dialogue with each other. That would be so cool. But beyond my ability there, they speak to and sometimes past each other, enrich each other's thinking, and they illuminate each other's thinking in so many ways. I'm going to just riff on one thing all readers of Jacobs all remember well. How she when she says, "Reader, you cannot understand." There's a moment in Douglas, I think it's in My Bondage and My Freedom, when he says, but ask the slave what is his condition and what it is thinking, and so on and so forth. And you might as well address your questions to the silent dead. There comes no voice from the enslaved. And, I think every reader of Douglas, and I think including readers then, would say, well, wait. You're the voice that, right, you're the voice that is coming from the enslaved, from the region of the dead, from the region of social death, or whatever we might call it now. And but I think when Douglas says this is his way of saying that there is such a profound incommensurability between the experience he's trying to describe and the language that he has at his disposal to say it, that he's sort of saying the same thing that Harriet Jacobs is saying. So this is my way of thinking about the very first thing you raised, which is how we now as scholars, trying to read them, we too are involved in the kind of ethics of reading and relationality with them, where I feel it's so important to finally respect their otherness, to put it overused word, like that. And so that means that in any book or article or whatever we write, we just have to constantly keep putting in these reminders of this thing we're calling incommensurability a little bit, but in a way that's at the level of what we're doing, that to me it has a strong analogy with what you're saying Jacobs is doing. That is, she's finding these interstitial spaces where, where resistance comes into being that can't be seen as such. They're hidden as such. So in some sense, we're kind of interested in the mirroring of critical practice with the practice that you see her modeling. That's kind of what. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I found myself thinking the answer to it. Sorry.
Yeah.
And do I have time for a quick question or
Indeed.
not?
Yep.
I've got so many questions, but so power is such a gendered word, right? And Douglas, to his credit, does a lot to try to de-gender that word, including the whole beginning of My Bondage and My Freedom, which is much more centered on women and their conditions of possibility that the women in his life made possible for him, in terms of coming to consciousness of his powers and his dignity and so on. And he uses this phrase, tendrils of affection, when his grandmother leaves him behind at the Great Lloyd Plantation. he says, well, I felt really bad for a few days, but then the tendrils of affection began to twine around all of these new objects. And she uses that exact phrase, tendrils of affection, Harriet Jacobs does. So I'm kind of shifting to what do you, when Jacobs, what is her, what she's trying to name the energy that drives resistance. Does she have, are there metaphors, or how would you, do you know what I'm saying? How would, Douglas is power, 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 but then he'll say, well, actually, it's also tendrils of affection sometimes, so we're going to go like that. What is Jacobs' language for that? So we get away from this resistance as reaction, but more resistance as always being prior to. Does she struggle with that?
I would say she shows more than tells.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Even though
yeah,
that
exactly.
distinction
Yeah,
might be quite
yeah.
arbitrary.
Yeah.
But I think she couches the kind of driving force of resistance within relationality.
Okay.
Because there are all of these moments where she could act in one way, but then she opts to act in another way because someone checked her, right? Because someone reflected back that her condition was not so. For instance, when she is in the garret space and she learns that her brother has escaped successfully in the north, and her brother is her children's father's property, and she's immediately concerned that his absence is going to put her children in peril, because he could very easily sell them to recuperate the loss of his absconded property. And so she's self-preserving. She's thinking about her family. And one of the older black women on the plantation says, you should be celebrating his freedom. And she realizes that in this moment of her kin's freedom, she's more concerned with her own captivity, and that this woman who isn't even kin to him is celebrating his escape. And so she sees this as a moment of being humbled, that there's a bigger struggle for freedom than one that just pertains to her personal safety and that of her children, but that is about the mass emancipation and liberation. So I think it's about relationality.
Yeah.
Like, it's these moments of seeing her subjectivity, becoming conscious, becomes only possible in relationship to the people around her.
Thank you. Other questions?
And just for everyone in terms of the question and answer period, if you can talk into the microphone for the recording.
Thank you for fantastic panel. I sort of feel like there's so much great stuff to come, but if it just ended now, Dainu. I mean, these were both such good papers. I have a question that occurred to me listening to your talk, Nick, and was sharpened listening, or intensified listening to Jasmine, and then still more listening to you two talk to each other. And maybe it's a tired question about amazingly fresh work, but I was thinking about, like, when you're talking about the metaphor of how much Douglas talks about being bound. Another signification of bound, obviously, is being on pages between the covers of a book.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about writing when I was listening to both of you. And maybe it's a tired question because it's something scholars of slave narrative, talked about a generation ago. But, I mean, Jacobs has all that negotiating she's doing with the protocols of writing and with her sort of presumptive initial, white middle class abolitionist readers, and Douglas is doing all this stuff to refigure the categories he's engaging. So I guess I'm just wondering if there's ways to connect the analysis you gave of his political philosophy and your giving of, we have the loophole of retreat because that's what she called it in the pages of her text, right? So are there ways to put the practices of and thinking about freedom that you've been identifying sort of more explicitly together with their practice as speakers in Douglas' case and writers in both cases?
Well, I mean, there's tons to say on that topic. I think there's so much, and just starting with the metaphor that Douglas is using, says our rights are written upon, or like that. And I don't, I guess I don't have a synthetic comment to make. I could just share a couple of other ways that the question that you ask is still a fresh question, even though, yeah, that was a question when we were so keenly aware of everything being representation, right? In the wake of discovery that the real is not here, we only have access to representation. Got this great journal called Representations, comes out, everyone wants to be published there, and it was a great moment of 20 years of literary scholarship where we're just like really looking at that. Now, some of the ways that I find that question still animates Douglas's work. One thing is he was such a performer as an orator, and he was first known and celebrated as an orator. The first books about him are called Douglas the Orator. It's all and James McCune Smith has this great essay that is not read enough about black oratory in the antebellum period. He's not really talking about writing, he's talking about oratory. So here we are, all we have are the words. We don't have oratory. But Douglas did write some things as written texts, and those would be his autobiographies. So that's interesting to be tracking, is how can we read the speeches as much as we can as performances in a way that they're different because of the presence of the author, which we don't have, and the concealment of the author from the reader in the text is something that Jacobs is very aware of as a trope for her reader-writer relation. But I'll just say that one of the things that I've and it gets back to relationality. We all know the famous remark of Douglas's, you have seen how a man was made a slave. Now you will see how a slave was made a man. And, that's called chiasmus in rhetoric, that's when the statement reverses itself like that. And this is a signature move of Douglas's rhetorical style, in fact, and you start to see not everywhere quite so clearly and crisply as that, but very often he will structure it that way. Well, when you start thinking about chiasm in terms of relationality and the crossing of the reception of the text with the performance of it and so on and so forth, it becomes like a really, really interesting way to think about relationality in these works, and the way relationality kind of hooks up with this, rhetoric and what we see on the surface. We would typically think of rhetoric as being kind of like just the way that it's the envelope that the message comes in, but of course we also know that it's actually the form that the message takes. So that's one thing I've become more aware of, and that's one way that that question is still very, very fresh, I think, and should always be a fresh question in the field. Yeah.
And yet has such deep biblical foundations.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just thinking about the movement from the human cry to the wish to the demand,
Right.
and how that echoes in the beginning there was the word, right? Like, this movement from being to being conscious of being often takes place through inscription or through oration, through the exclamation, the sound of being human, of suffering, humanity. And there's something really powerful, I think, in folks who have been rendered mute speaking for themselves despite the incommensurability of representation, right?
Yeah.
Despite the impossibility of being heard. despite the kind of conscriptions of representation that they take on by just opening their mouths. The moment in 12 Years a Slave, where the film rendering of 12 Years a Slave, where the mother who's lost her child is screaming, wailing, moaning, goes on for a very long, there's a lot of extended, suspended moments of aesthetic experience in that film that I think are really powerful, and that wail is one of them, and it was so disruptive to the sensibility of those watching it around me, that there was a white middle-aged man nearby who made a visibly, like an audible, like grunt, like please stop, like, and it was just so an interesting encounter of sound and representation, and how we can't even sit with the representation of sorrow, of grief, without wanting to mute it. And what is that instinct really about? Because in the visceral, somatic kind of information coming from those two moments seems relevant to our contemporary desire to build a wall or put people in prison or deny people refuge in this country, right? So, yeah, silencing becomes this antithesis to wailing, sound, cry, you know, in ways that I think writing mediates in really interesting, if not always effective ways. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, no, I won't, but I'll ask you that.
There was one other.
Yeah, no.
hand.
Yeah, that's great, that's really, yeah.
Oh, hi. Those were wonderful papers. Thank you. I maybe connect some of these thoughts is chiasmus. I think most of Marx's early manuscripts actually always doing that. I didn't know what it was called, but and linked to species being, and linked to an idea in which power is essentially interrelational. Whereas in Douglas, it doesn't seem to be that there's tendrils of affection. It does seem more gendered, I guess. So I wanted to go back to your, I mean, or whose question was it? But the question of the solidarity, really, because Douglas has it, but it seems to follow from, well, the question is, what is the relationship between sociality and people's and power and people's sense of their power? And I mean, it seems to rely in some sense on being recognized. And then the question is, well, whose recognition matters? And that in turn relates to the question of resistance and what enables resistance, as if it weren't ever just an internal or an external thing, but some chemistry that's happening. So my question is about power and solidarity, and that sense in Douglas that they may be too separated. That's a question. And the question about retreat, what's so interesting about retreat is it seems, in one hand, it's her by herself, but she's not by herself. So the question about, and your language of the congregational seems really interesting to me. So I wanted to put together your language of the congregational and the language of power, and to ask if they're really two ways of talking about the same thing or really very different.
I just saw the opera people that were done in the next person.
I heard them as related.
Be my
Just-
guest.
Just
Absolutely, go for it.
quite
Yeah,
simply,
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, they are related.
they are related. I mean, I don't know that, let's see, the consciousness of power which suggests the exercise of rights. Is that what you, is that the right?
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Consciousness
yeah.
of power that requires the exercise of rights. There has to be a place where that happens, right? And it's in between, adjoining places is how one historian talks about it. Closer to places that draw people closer to freedom is how Camp talks about it. I just think that situating those spaces of mutual recognition in a material landscape of surveillance and punishment and criminalization is really important for us right now, because I think the kind of visceral effects of the rise of fascism make us feel all so much more vulnerable and so much more isolated at the very moment when are turning towards each other for an understanding of what time it is and what might be possible seems all the more imperative, right? And I'm just noticing that there are all of these public spaces that are being made to seem uninhabitable or precarious, like places of worship, right? Movies, schools. The fact that all these public places are the places that are being targeted, I don't think is an accident. There was always already an attrition from public space, attrition from civic life happening before 9/11, and that was documented by political scientists. And I think there's an even greater reason to be concerned about that right now, because this is the very moment when we need to find our consciousness of each other and in each other's company.
Yeah, that actually picks up on what I was going to ask. Thinking about Stephanie Camp's work and how, if I'm remembering it, she talks about withdrawal to places that are either in a more like natural environment where there's flora and fauna that provides protection, but also a place to come together. You know, you don't go to the woods by yourself. You go with your congregants and with your worshiping people, or conversely, places that could be sites of the labor of enslavement. So the corn shucking, you know, places where agricultural products are stored or processed can also become a part in a barn or a shack, a place where people come together. And having that natural world around you is part of the nurturing. You know, and it was so different from your description of building that little trap door, completely man-made, completely closed in, you know, away not only from other people, but from the creation. And that's one thing that I think makes that whole section so claustrophobic, you know, is the lack of light, the lack of awareness, and really does remind one of prison conditions now, and no plants, no animals, no, you know, things that we know are hardwired in us to make us human and do bestow power. We need an environment, and when we don't have one, people go mad, you know. And I was thinking about Douglas living most of his life as an urban person, in this kind of odd space of connection, but also surveillance at the same time. So it's not really a question, but I thought about that with the camp. So. 1, 2, 3 questions.
Thank you. This is spectacular. I wanted to follow up on the comments about Camp 2, but maybe in a slightly different direction. Yasmin, I was really interested in your response to Nick and to Mark about the text and recounting that story of Jacob's hearing about her brother, and having one reaction and then sort of this coming to consciousness. And so, because my feeling was, well, she was right the first time, in some senses. But I think because there is I think part of what your work does is really help to think about not prioritizing different forms of abolitionisms, but thinking about the congregational, but also the non-congregational forms of flight. And it's not choosing one over the other, but really, one of the things that camp does so well is to think about the people, typically the women who are left behind, and sort of what are the temporary practices of freedom that are available when you are trying to maintain those connections at all cost. And so part of what I think is so interesting about your reading of Douglas, I'm not sure if there's a question in this, is the way it doesn't, it's not so much about it providing an account of masculinist forms of fugitivity, bad, congregate, but really thinking about how different abolitionist practices are coexisting in tension with each other and sometimes working against each other in the same space. So that's sort of question mark at the end of that. But I love the language of congregation, and for Douglas, you have the Sabbath schools, but that doesn't come with him in some senses. So I'll just stop there. But I think what's so great about Jacobs is that she's reflecting on the multiple forms of flight.
And it's hard. Thank you so much for bringing that up because I think my own tendency is to celebrate the ways in which she moves that mimic the ways that I celebrate movement today. And it's so much more complicated and more rich than that. And I talk about it sometimes, but it's clear that I privilege particular forms of flight than over others. But Diva and I were talking a couple weeks ago about this practice that her grandmother has that makes it possible for her even to have a space to hide in, which is her midnight bakings. And so the grandmother spends her nights baking biscuits for the white women of the town, and through the money that she makes from her midnight bakings is able to buy her house, buy her freedom, and buy that of her sons. And what does it mean that there are these kind of resistances to slavery that are happening within the economic bounds of its logics, and what kind of conditions of possibility do they engender, even though they seem quite conscripted and limited, right? So there might not be and then also the fact that the editor encourages her to end her narrative with a reflection of her grandmother rather than a celebration of Harper's Ferry, which was her original intent, seems at first to be kind of creating a hierarchy between a celebration of direct resistance over these tendrils of affection, right? And perhaps it's actually not that clear cut. Maybe the tension between them is more generative to sit with than their oppositionality. I think that's really helpful.
Thank you both for these papers. I had a question for Yasmin about, and it kind of follows actually from Gretchen's question to you or commentary just now. Kind of lurking at the periphery of your talk was this idea that a kind of congregational orientation to abolition, grounded in no place or tied to it in some ways, had the capacity to reimagine, reconfigure our relationship with land. You mentioned land, and I just would like to invite you to talk a little bit about how that might be the case. At the very least, because at a superficial level, there may be a tension between no place and the expanse of land or nature, but maybe that's not the case, and I would just like to hear kind of how you think about that.
What was the concern? That there might be a, that if
The,
it's
at least at a
any place, if-
superficial level, there may be a tension between the notion of no place and the notion of kind of land and habitation kind of thing. But maybe there isn't conceptually.
There are so many things that come to mind with that question. One of which is maybe a easily accessible point of engaging with it, is, I don't know how many of you all saw Wakanda, but this imaginary utopian space of Black self-determination, the kind of opening scene of our entry into Wakanda is expanse, right? And it has this like frontier-like aesthetic. And there's in fact people on, like men on horses, like riding through this expanse, and like this is our introduction to a liberatory Black space. And I was just, oh, like, okay. Right? So in order to have freedom, we still need to territorialize land. And I think part of what I've been sitting with in centering Jacobs in the abolitionist tradition is the kind of prophetic praxis that she's authorizing that draws on, certainly, the kind of charismatic, prophetic tradition of Walker and Nat Turner and Douglass, right? But there's this resistance to make the project dependent upon settling anywhere, right? Because there is nowhere that's going to really be safe. So really we need to make it resistance possible anywhere, which, as you were talking, made me, of course, think about the notion of church in the Bible, and that church can be a physical brick and mortar place, but it could also be wherever those who worship convene, right? And so this idea that it can, like, transformation could happen anywhere is a totally different politics of relationality to the land than one that requires borders, fences, property, and such. And I think that creates a different kind of possibility for thinking about what freedom requires, if freedom requires an opposition to captivity or something else.
You know, just as a little quick aside on that, you know, in the revisions of the narrative that he made in My Bondage, My Freedom, Douglass obviously added a tremendous amount of material, and a lot of that material you could describe as nature. You know, there's a lot more about the natural world and his relation to the natural world, both as a small boy playing on the ladder and running outside and watching the squirrels, and there are these great scenes where he's in the woods and he's actually kind of relating to the blackbirds, the red-winged blackbirds. I don't know if you all remember that. It happens twice in My Bondage and My Freedom. And then the beginning of The Heroic Slave is exactly the same scene where Madison Washington is in the woods and he's having, okay, those birds, they're free, why am I not free moment. So so for Douglass, you put it so well, Jasmine, like, when does being become consciousness of being, okay? And in Romanticism, as a big phenomenon, English Romanticism especially, it happens in this encounter with nature.
Nature,
okay?
that's right, Robert Frost.
So we don't know whether Douglass was like, oh, he'd just gone out, read all of Wordsworth and Byron and whatever, and then said, yeah, that happened to me too.
Right.
Or did he actually really experience those things and a sense of both his coming to consciousness of himself as a person, but also coming to a consciousness of himself as a political being, or did that actually also really happen in his life, and or not? I always think of Jacobs as like, that's Blade Runner or The Matrix. And, and Douglass is more, whatever, Star Wars resistance or something. So, it's her, she is so intense. That it's just like, and it's, yeah. That matrix, that was for you, Neil.
Oh, that sends us into coffee really nicely, I think. Thank you so much to our